Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
This is Paul Axton, Director of Forging Plowshares and Plowshares Bible Institute. And in this conversation with Anthony Bartlett and Brad, Anthony is describing then his work, and we're taking up in this first podcast the issue of both Hiroshima, the dropping of the atomic bomb, but then the role of sacrifice, especially in the life of René Girard and the way that Raymund Schwager influenced Girard. And so part of the discussion then is about, first of all, obviously the picture of undoing sacrifice. And then second of all, why it is that Girard, in fact, turned from his original idea about sacrifice. And we then trace the role of Raymund Schwager, Peter Thiel, and J.D. Vance. That is, that there is a reading of René Girard that is, in a sense, bringing us to a kind of cataclysmic understanding. It is precisely this kind of cataclysmic ending, the idea that the world just seemed given over to sacrifice, that seemed to discourage Girard at the end of his life, and Tony describes that he kind of withdrew. I begin the podcast. We had just last week on Thursday, which was a week from August 6th, the dropping of the atomic bomb. And right now we're between August 6th and August 9th, the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki. Clifton Truman Daniel, the eldest grandson of Harry Truman, came to the Moberly Auditorium and was speaking and touched a little bit on the dropping of the bomb, but he mainly, told stories. And it was kind of an odd evening in the sense that it really was a journey back to the 1950s and almost like we lived in a pre-nuclear age. In other words, the elephant in the room that I couldn't ignore, but I think maybe many people can ignore, is that the world is going to change because of Harry Truman. Whether it was his character, I don't think so. It was just the circumstance, but certainly his character and his understanding played into it. And so we had the opportunity after the program to talk to Clifton, and I asked him about his grandfather's reaction to the bombs. I explained I had heard reports that he said he never lost a minute of sleep over the decision, or that the dropping of the bombs haunted him all of his life. And Clifton quickly moved away from us, and he realized what I was going to ask. That is, I had kind of broken the spell of not broaching this subject. I had felt free to broach it because Faith and he were having a very personal conversation about Faith's experience. Faith's father had been a chaplain in Japan, and they had been trading stories, but he had actually knelt down on the stage. But as soon as I brought this up, he immediately got up and started backing away from us. His grandfather, he said about that, he never said that. And then he repeated the usual understanding. He knew that it would save lives. This is a very interesting understanding, especially in light of this conversation with Anthony Bartlett. That is, that perhaps one of the greatest holocausts in human history in terms of an explosive weapon was the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, the understanding is that this sacrifice is necessary, which at just a practical level, it was not necessary, and I'll explain why that's the case. But the way in which Truman often pictured that, he said, well, I slept soundly. And so, in fact, his grandfather, according to Robert Clifton and Greg Mitchell, they say in their book that the metaphor of sleep was his best known reaction. He said this many times. There was no debating the issue, that as early as 1959, He declared, as he did many times subsequently, that I never lost any sleep over my decision. Sleeping soundly was a kind of sign that the decision was a correct decision, and it almost gives you the sense of the post-sacrifice. You think of the scapegoating mechanism, and then this kind of strange peace that comes over those who sacrifice the victim. That is the peace through sacrifice. I think we may link that to what Truman is describing, that he did feel great peace. Maybe he did sleep without a troubled conscience. But in fact, Truman himself is going to begin to question that. But the point is that immediately he describes elation. He says that the dropping of the bomb and announcing that was the happiest announcement he had ever made in his life. That is, there's something in the bomb itself, and that's what Lifton and Mitchell, they describe this. I think it's there for many people, and it's almost like we can see the rise of this sacrificial mechanism in our age, perhaps in the dropping of the atomic bomb. And so for Truman, to sleep quickly, he had always had trouble with sleep, by the way. He had always had trouble with insomnia and anxiety. But this was kind of his metaphor. He told Paul Tibbets, who piloted the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, "Don't you ever lose any sleep over the fact that you planned and carried out that mission. It was my decision. You had no choice." And so he wanted Tibbets, he wanted the world, really, even the people in Hiroshima, to sleep soundly. That now we've all attained kind of the peace that I guess maybe Harry Truman himself had been seeking. And that's what the various biographies, other than the hagiographies, bring out about Truman, is that he's a very conflicted man, that all of his life, he was afraid of being seen as a sissy. In the movie Oppenheimer, when Oppenheimer comes into his office and he says that I have blood on my hands, and he began to wring his hands. Truman's reaction, to that, he has him escorted out of the office and he says, "Don't ever bring that man around me again." He found that kind of sensitivity, what he would call Oppenheimer the rest of his life. He'd call him that crybaby scientist. He was repulsed by that kind of sensitivity. Of course, the good sleep metaphor was part of that. He just didn't want to be seen as someone who had troubled thoughts about it. Now, the irony is that, of course, Truman is human. He's actually a little more complicated than he may have wanted people to think. But as Lifton and Mitchell note, he was preoccupied with the dropping of the bomb, it seems, right up to the end of his life. Tom Clark, his former attorney general, told of visiting Truman in a Kansas City hospital 4 or 5 months before his death. And they told him don't stay very long because he's dying. And Clark remained for about 45 minutes. And he said that during much of that time, all that Truman wanted to talk about was justification for dropping the bomb. Far from sleeping well and being untroubled and being confident in his decision, I think he spent his life, maybe his final conversations, over this issue that he said, I never lost any sleep. The other incident, and maybe the only incident we have recorded, in which Truman openly expressed regret, was that Joe O'Donnell, who was a photographer and he had been in Hiroshima, he was on the beach in Wake Island with Truman and a couple of other newsmen, and O'Donnell asked him if he had any second thoughts about the decision to drop the bomb. And according to O'Donnell, Truman quickly replied, "Hell yes," and then added, "I've had a lot of misgivings about it, and I inherited a lot more." We don't know exactly what he meant by he had inherited a lot more, but I think in the lens of history, we have the idea that it was a problem that really didn't even need solving, that it was a foregone conclusion that he had dropped the bomb. But actually, most of the generals, and by most, I think we could just go through and list them, including Eisenhower, including Henry Stimson, including William Leahy, including Henry Arnold, Admiral Halsey, Chester Nimitz, Curtis LeMay, who had actually innovated firebombing over Tokyo. They all were against dropping the bomb. Eisenhower was very troubled, and Eisenhower told him as much. We know that Truman was given other information. And part of what I'm saying here is that we may lose track that there was something about the bomb, there was something in the sacrifice that Truman was willing to make. And certainly he was, in a sense, that he was carried along by events. And sure, maybe people spoke more strongly in hindsight. But all of these generals, spoke out, Eisenhower both before and after, and referred to it as a war crime, a Holocaust, a barbarity, a return to the Dark Ages. They thought that it was a travesty. And Eisenhower, certainly thought that, and he confides that to his diary. And so we often have the image, and this is kind of a product of propaganda, but actually I think it's another indication of the power of the scapegoating mechanism. Of course, the mechanism doesn't quite work in our day and age, but we have this idea that, that was necessary. We had no choice. It was an absolute necessity. But when you go back in history, we learn, no, actually, it was not a necessity. In fact, people who knew best said the Japanese were defeated. And we know that, that they were ready to negotiate, that the issue of the emperor was one of the key things. And the military men said, they were defeated. This idea actually doesn't even take into account the thing that we always hear is, it's a choice of either dropping the atomic bomb or that we will invade. And if we invade, we'll lose 500,000 men. And that number, by the way, through the years just went up and up. There were original estimates under 20 to up to 60, but never 500,000. But of course, what's not taken into account in that is once they had the bomb, invasion was off the table. And so we often hear, that's the choice. No, that wasn't the choice. They knew they were going to drop the bomb. The choice that Truman could have made, but he did not make, was to negotiate. That is, before dropping the atomic bomb. These things are just clear. You don't need to think very hard about it. That Truman, personally, he didn't want to be seen as weak, as he, would put down people. He'd say, he's a sissy. And actually, he referred to himself as a child. He said, I was just a sissy. I was afraid. And of course, he had this kind of innate fear, a threat to his masculinity. And he saw any kind of deep thought, any kind of sensitivity, empathy. He saw these things as being a sissy, as feminine. And one of the things he wanted most was to be seen as masculine. And he certainly didn't want to be seen as someone who contemplated things or was indecisive. And so he's known, this is the way he described his job as president, was to come in and make decisions. The buck stops here. That was what he was known for. Henry Wallace said as soon as he came into office, he seemed eager to make decisions with great promptness. Everything he said was decisive, but it almost seemed as though he was eager to decide in advance of thinking. And actually, that may sound overly critical, but of course that's the point. He doesn't want to feed too much information into the decision-making process. Even in his own mind, he's going to cut off information. And so the point of this is not any kind of character or assassination of Truman. It's just to say that we can see Truman going through the same stages as any sacrificer may go through. That he was more complicated, I think, than he would want us to believe, and maybe than he really wanted to be. He always had this kind of sensitivity. Alonzo Hamby, in his biography, he pictures Truman as a kind of overachiever who spent his life attempting to show his confidence, a confidence that, in fact, he did not possess. And we might, think of this in psychoanalytic terms, that he's trying to gain his sense of self. And of course, this weapon is so powerful that everyone associated with it, they feel the power of the weapon of kind of omnipotence. So Truman describes being jubilant, elated because of this biggest bomb that had ever been made. One of his aides describes him and Churchill at the Potsdam conference when they got news of the bomb, that they were like little boys with a big red apple secreted on their person. And so suddenly, we often think the Japanese were the threat, but the point is, well, no, at that point, the Japanese were no threat at all, even in Truman's mind. He stopped talking at Potsdam about the Japanese and immediately talked about the Russians. He said of the Russians, I'll certainly have a hammer on these boys. And so the Japanese, in his mind, were already defeated. It was just a matter of using the bomb. He couldn't wait to use it. And so the picture is that partly what's caught up in the story of the dropping of the atomic bomb, and I don't think we can forget that, is a person and persons. And it's people trying to arrive at a sense of self. Lifton and Mitchell, and Lifton is, by the way, a psychologist. He says to keep the self functional, a man like Truman needs power surges. He received just that when he gave his first presidential speech to Congress and mentioned his commitment to unconditional surrender. I think he felt it again with the bomb. As he says about it, it's the greatest thing in history. And when news reached him of the destruction of Hiroshima, he said it was the happiest announcement he ever made. And so the picture is that Lifton talks about this, that there's maybe no greater power that someone exercises over another human being than their life. To be able to take their life, killing, is the ultimate feeling of empowerment, serving feelings of immortality, and even a godlike omnipotence. And so to kill hundreds of thousands with one blow, that might explain Truman's description of what he calls a kind of absolute happiness, a jubilation. And so there is a kind of relieving of his own personal anxiety, and I'm quoting Mitchell here, that it's his fears combined strangely and tragically with the bomb, what they call a bomb-centered omnipotence. This is not something unique to Truman, and it would have taken someone of unique caliber to have resisted, perhaps, dropping the bomb. But for Truman, this was his success. It meant his political success. It was the solution to the war. And in many ways, it was the end of his personal struggle. The bomb seemed to enable him to do everything, to solve and transcend all immediate problems, to bring about instant victory, as well as control of the future. And it offered those who used it a kind of deity's dominion and immortality, according to Lifton and Mitchell. So it was evident, as time went on. There was a period when Truman seemed to actually be debating, and certainly the people around him were giving him both sides of this, but perhaps stronger and stronger the view of dropping the bomb. And of course, those who resisted, Truman didn't really want to hear about it. As he saw the devastation, the radiation poisoning became clear, and of course Truman thought, that it was a conventional weapon. At least that's the way he talked about it. And he talked about it that way, even if he knew that wasn't true. The thing that people feared, the Americans didn't want to be seen using chemical weapons like the Germans did. And of course, the Germans used that same justification of saving lives in World War I when they used chemical weapons. So what he immediately, when he sees the devastation in Japan, he tells Henry Wallace, my headaches have returned, that he had always had trouble with headaches. The day that they, in fact, decided on the surrender terms, he said, my headaches every day. And Wallace asked him, are you speaking figuratively or literally? Truman said both. And so he really, in spite of his saying he slept well, Truman suffered. We know he's human, that to just sleep through it. And of course, that's what Clifton, his grandson, was afraid, I think, when having this conversation, that obviously the sleep thing was a kind of, his good sleep, his supposed decisiveness, his public ploy of this confidence was just a personal mode of surviving, maybe his own immediate self-condemnation, but it was certainly caught up with the personality of the man. And even Truman would back off these things, when a Democratic politician asked him, jubilation over the death of innocent people, do you think that's appropriate? And Truman immediately lied. He said, "Oh no, I meant over Russia entering the war." And later he would even change his notion of sleeping well. He said, "Well, I lost sleep over our boys. It broke my heart when just one of our soldiers, sailors, or Marines died, but I didn't lose any sleep over Japanese lives." And of course, what the point here, the metaphor breaks down, that the sacrificial system that Truman got caught up in. Just think if he had known about something like the power of the sacrifice, this Girardian understanding. Of course, it would have required him to study these sorts of things. Obviously, this understanding is post-dates Truman. But the thing that his good sleep does, and he reiterates this many times, is that he would do it again. He said this, a favorite phrase is, "I'd do it again. I wouldn't hesitate to drop the A-bomb again," he says. And so this deep sleep was meaning, I'm not going to reconsider whether I made a mistake. He threatened to use the bomb, or he was tempted to use it on Korea. And of course, the policy that we've received, kind of the nuclear diplomacy that we've inherited from Truman, is this notion, there was no questioning the dropping of the bomb. So there's great danger in just allowing this kind of naive understanding as if that's the only option that was there. That's always the case in scapegoating. That's always the case in sacrifice. Maybe that's just always the case in murder. That is, that people that murder, they always say, I had no choice. I had to do it. It was only maybe Dwight Eisenhower was the only president to ever say this was the bad decision. You can't really be a president today at this point in time and question Truman's decision. And so what comes with that is this idea that the nuclear option is always on the table. And of course, right now, Trump has threatened to use the weapon. We're in a war with Iran, trying to take away their development of any kind of weapon. And so the sleep idiom that Truman uses, that Clifton, wouldn't even, he said, he never said that. Well, he actually said it many times. My question, which was it? And of course, the answer to my question was, it was both. He used that metaphor, and he was deeply troubled then by this thing. The picture that we have, in this age in which Putin, Netanyahu, Kim, Trump, they're all living out the Truman doctrine in regard to the atomic option. This willingness to commit genocide, maybe to bring down the world, maybe to start a nuclear war. That seems to be the qualification. You have to be willing to push the button. Now, strangely, even Truman comes to regret all this, and he expresses this in his farewell speech. He describes any future war that we're in danger of extinguishing millions of lives at one blow, demolishing the great cities of the world, wiping out the cultural achievements of the past, and destroying the very structure of a civilization that has been slowly and painfully built up through hundreds of generations. He concludes that such war it's not a policy for rational men, he says. But of course, all this comes too late. He had already let the nuclear weapons proliferate. They'd already undertaken tests in the various islands. He had witnessed these tests. And so this minor incident, I realized, this issue of did he sleep soundly or not, it may sound trivial. But of course, we've all inherited this kind of false, simple-minded confidence that has brought about nuclear arms proliferation. We need in some way to examine and take up and recognize, maybe through a Girardian understanding, through something like what Anthony Bartlett is giving us, and we discussed this in this conversation, that we're under threat. And this thing that we have in the gospel, it's quite literally, in other words, the Girardian point is that salvation is available, and what we mean by salvation is salvation from this world destruction that we could potentially bring on. That is the exposure of the scapegoating mechanism, the picture of Christ as displacing that violent logos and giving us an alternative word. This is salvation from this violent kind of sacrificial system that still has us in its grip. You know, the racism, the vengeance, the self-righteousness, the lack of empathy, maybe even the possibility of empathy. There's a blindness, and we have to recognize going into any situation, whether it's international, whether it's personal, that these are typical, that we're blinded to seeing the victim. And for many Americans, they still can't see the victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The women, the children, the people whose lives were destroyed. So if we examine the cause of the blinding scapegoating and recognize it, see from a larger perspective, maybe that's the beginning. But if we're comfortable with this notion of, good sleep, not losing sleep, I'm afraid we're all doomed. And so in this conversation, Anthony Bartlett is unfolding his book, Love's Entanglement. But in the first part of the conversation, we're just this nuclear option, the sacrificial option, and the sense in which Girard himself may have failed or withdrawn from the strength of his own position. Forging Plowshares is a nonprofit ministry, and we greatly appreciate your donations, which allow us to continue our ministry. We do have a couple of upcoming classes. We're going to do a reading class. Ethan Vanderleek is going to lead us in a class reading the trilogy from William Desmond. I'm going to do a class in sin and salvation. We'll bring out more of those as classes are not open, but you can certainly begin to think about the possibility. Donations can be made through Outreach International. The website is oionline.org, and our project number is FP3901. Select PayPal or Simple Give to make a donation. And we certainly appreciate your donations. Hope you enjoy this conversation. This is part one of a two-part conversation between Brad and I, and of course, the premier Girardian, I think, of our day, Anthony Bartlett. I so appreciate your stuff. By the way, I just sat down yesterday. I read your book yesterday and today, and I think I've gotten through most all of it.
Love's Entanglement.
Yeah, Love's Entanglement. I had been through your other works before. And of course, in the lectures, you're kind of setting us up for this conversation, I think. In this book, I just see you kind of bringing it all together.
That's what I'm trying to do, yeah. Because I felt, well, we could talk about this, but I felt that there was an element that was not catered for in the other books. I mean, I set out a method which deals with some of the problems, but there's not a kind of a holism offered, and I wanted to do something more holistic. And Love's Entanglement tries to do that.
You did it. You captured it.
Oh, good, Paul.
This is it. In other words, it is. I'm hoping that that's not the end of your your work, but you have brought it. In other words, you brought it to a conclusion here.
Yes, I have. Yeah. Next week, I think the Colloquium on Violence and Religion quarterly bulletin should be coming out. And there's a really good review of Love's Entanglement in there. I think it's going to be up. by a French man by the name of Bernard Perret, who really
Yeah.
is excellent.
I know Bernard. We interviewed him.
Yes, you did. That's right.
And he seems to be kind of in on the cutting edge of things. He's still involved with the Esprit, is that right? And
He is. He's on the board, I think.
was he one of the original? Did he know Girard also? And
I don't think he was one of that generation. I think he's come on later. He's an engineer by training, he says, but he certainly has read very widely and has, an enormously good grasp of the issues. Yeah, he's a kind of Catholic, but of a wider, Vatican II plus a kind.
yeah, not a dyed in the wool.
No, he's not dyed in the wool. In fact, his book on the sacred, because the Catholic Church and the sacred is actually very stringent, really. I mean, he's getting to the roots of the real issues in the Catholic Church. I mean, he doesn't do it. He doesn't. His language is marvelously moderated. I admire him for the way his language is so calm and non-provocative. But the depth of his insight and his critique is very powerful.
The thing that I am curious about, today we're between the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki.
Exactly right.
I did a deep dive into, obviously my time in Japan has made me a little more aware, but I also just happened to we went to hear the grandson of Harry Truman.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, you mentioned that. My goodness, that's sounded fascinating, man.
Well, the thing that happened, it was a nice evening, it kind of took us back to the 1950s, and good old
Oh,
Harry,
whoa.
all that stuff. I was
Oh, my
happy to
goodness.
leave it at that, but Faith was determined to go talk to him. I didn't particularly want to talk to him, I'll be honest, but she wanted to go up and, just tell him about that her father had been there, during or right after the war and was stationed there, and then they came back.
Oh, he was? Oh.
Yeah. So we were there 20 years. Faith grew up there. It gives you a different perspective.
Right.
On the whole issue. So I had one question for him. And I said, I've heard that your grandfather said that he lost no sleep, that he slept soundly after this. But I also heard that he was haunted by this his whole life. And I said, which is it?
Yeah, right.
And he was talking to Faith, and very just kind of right near us. And as soon as I said that, he stood up, and literally he was on a stage, so he stood up and started backing away from us.
Oh, wow.
And I wasn't trying to be provocative.
No.
But clearly I had touched a nerve. And he got up, he said he never said that.
Oh, really? Mm.
Well, I knew he had, and I went and looked it up. This was, in fact, Harry Truman's constant refrain. In other words, if somebody would ask him, that he would say, well, I've never lost any sleep. And he told Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, I don't want you to lose any sleep over this. This is my thing. I made the decision. But of course, the whole issue, and this is that actually he's trying to say it was the right decision. We don't need to worry about it. But of course, underneath that, he was worried about it his whole life. And obviously he would be and was, I think, haunted by the issue. So that even as he's dying in his hospital room, one of his friends comes to him, and that's all they talk about. He's only got weeks or months to live, and all that Harry Truman wants to talk about is justification for having dropped the bomb, that he feels justified in having done that. And of course, I think that your stuff, that what we're doing right here directly addresses, in other words, there's nothing more. In World War II, we have the German Holocaust, against the Jews. And then we have the American Holocaust perpetrated on the Japanese. That clearly, I think, and you bring this up, I noticed this several times in your book, the atomic Holocaust.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I think that that's ultimately that we are talking about human survival in your work.
Thank you. I think that's correct. Well, it's nice of you to say. I mean, anybody who's a writer, I suppose, or a thinker, a question like that or a statement like that plunges you into the depths of your own process, and it goes back to childhood. And there's no doubt that the echo of war, and it was the Second World War, and I didn't initially know about the atomic bomb, but it was certainly there in my parents' consciousness, and everybody knew about it. And there was a kind of haunting already right back there in my childhood. And I think that was, well, there's other reasons for it, but that I would be particularly sensitive to it. But I think everybody on that generation and subsequent generations, once they drop the bomb, are they going to drop the bomb on us, as the song says? Like that. Everyone has that feeling and or that sense somewhere or other, and you cannot not be aware of it. So the human consciousness, I mean, it has to be quite radically different, that the very substance of life that sustains life and future human generations could actually evaporate, could go, and because of our own action. This is not a divine intervention of any sort. This is extreme human folly. And that is a living, constant human possibility that's going to change the way anybody feels about their existence on planet Earth. I mean, everybody's got to feel differently somehow or other about it. And as I say, as a writer or a thinker, it is there for me. It's there right from the get-go. And all my work really is kind of levied against that, really, to try to find a way forward for humanity, presented with this awful possibility of self-omnicide. There has to be another way of human. This is not a way for human beings to live. You can't, even though we haven't dropped it, or we dropped it on the Japanese, but a widespread nuclear exchange has not occurred. But just the very threat of it is no way for humanity to live. So theology itself, everything is, as they say, you can't do theology unless it's at the gates of Auschwitz. John Baptist Metz said that, I think. And you can't do theology except with an aerial view of Hiroshima in your mind. I don't think you can. You shouldn't. It's an abuse of thought not to have that vision in your mind. So yeah, I mean, for me, there's no doubt about it. And I very much, and I think Pope Leo the 14th, his generation, where he comes from, in fact, he's American, and that he's actually younger than me. He is aware of this as well. So, what's coming out of him now reflects that background experience. And so I think Christian theology and Christian pastoral leadership is more and more concerned with it.
And the question that that your book is about salvation, but of course you're putting salvation in a different place. You're making it a real world, practical salvation.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The displacement that took place in, I suppose, from the end of the 2nd century onwards, or maybe even earlier, getting out of the 1st century, the displacement to the, in shorthand, the Platonic other world, so deeply skewed the whole biblical progression, its narrative, its story, what the God of Israel is engaged in, and what Israel, what the Jewish experience means by its God. All that is so skewed by the Platonic otherworldism that we're being forced back, I think, to those real considerations of what the Bible is really, what the character of that narrative and that language is, because of the possibility of destroying the planet, And I mean, what's the use of the other world, of the Platonic other world, if you've destroyed the basis by which it's imagined and thought in the first place? I mean, you could say you're going to destroy that other world too. I mean, because you've destroyed its cultural and metaphysical substructure, whatever. I mean, can you be sure it's going to exist afterwards? You've destroyed everything which produced it in the first place. So it's a very desperate. I don't think Platonic thought or metaphysics answers the bomb at all. It can't. I don't think that metaphysical thinking has a response to the atomic bomb. It just does not.
And that's kind of what got me about Truman's grandson. He's gone and talked to the hibakusha, the survivors. He's tried to do good things. And yet if he keeps insisting that this was, his grandfather, he didn't even want to admit that there was even the possibility that this was a huge mistake, a tragedy, a Holocaust.
Right. It was a Holocaust. It was a symbolic Holocaust that cannot be reversed. It cannot be undone because it's breached a barrier that we didn't even know existed until we did it. And I think the present generation of political leadership is kind of like dancing around that possibility again, not because it makes any sense, but because they're like moths to a flame. They're irresistibly drawn to it. It's a horrific sacrificial possibility.
I think it's empowering to the people that are involved. And I think that's what Truman, you hate to think of him in these terms, but you can just see the bomb. And as these people came up with this ultimate power, it's almost like an omnipotent power.
Yes. Yeah.
And people are so drawn to this destructive possibility of sacrifice.
Yeah.
It is the ultimate sacrifice.
It is the ultimate sacrifice. It really is. I mean, with the Girardian thing that sacrifice doesn't work anymore, it's been destabilized, it's been exposed and destabilized. There's this thinking that, well, the bomb actually might work.
Yeah.
It will destroy everything, but it will be an effective sacrifice. Will restore the whole thing.
Like you have to deconstruct people's thinking and make them aware of the allure of this thing, because it's really Truman. He's really set the policy that by saying, "Oh, I never lost any sleep," he was also saying, and he did say this, I'll do it again. I would do it again in a minute. And of course,
But
that's the policy that he's handed on down to every president after him.
for him to come to terms with having done this, unless there is the ultimate horizon of love and forgiveness, there is no way to come to terms with having caused the death, to use the least loaded term, of so many people in such a horrific way. You know, without love and forgiveness, how could you come to that recognition? It's too overwhelming.
Well, the problem is that when you come to war and the killing of people in war, despite just war thought, which is supposed to protect civilians, there's this implication that it's not the same. That we have to, Augustine began it. You are entitled to kill the enemy. There is a logic there that doesn't really belong to the kingdom or to the command of love. He's able to. He would presumably be, until that breaks down inside him, until he says, "Oh, well, no, actually, in the end, it was killing and it was murder and it was as I say, the breaching of a symbolic barrier that makes a kind of absolute Holocaust possible." There has to be a double repentance, almost the repentance from the protected logic of war that we've had in Christendom for all these hundreds and hundreds of years, and then, of course, what you're talking about, Brad, which is the internal thing of, well, I like my fathers before me. I'm a murderer, and I need Jesus to take that on and bring me to some other place. So it's like it's a double conversion, and we're kind of faced with that at the moment, and it all gets muddled up. I mean, you got J.D. Vance talking about just war, and how the Pope himself doesn't understand just war. I understand it.
And in your book, you do bring up Peter Thiel, and of course, J.D. Vance is purely a product of Peter Thiel. But right. Can you run that down? Because what they are doing, and I'm not claiming I completely comprehended it, what Thiel and Vance are in fact building upon is the final turn of René Girard. Yes,
I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing kind of rereading your own stuff all the time, like when I reread Seven Stories, because we're trying to republish it on Kindle. Shout out to Seven Stories, very, very useful kind of church Christian community study book. But I'm thinking to myself, this is theology at a very important level, and it's not being widely practiced. And this is not a matter of tooting my own horn, but I just can just see it and feel it. And in respect of Girard, exactly what you said, Paul, that Girard makes a turn, and it's a kind of slow turn, as I'm reading it now, even just this morning, that from the time he wrote Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, it came out in 1978, to the time he makes his renunciation or his retraction about sacrifice in 1995 at 17 years. Raymund Schwager is writing to him all during that, but they have this exchange, this epistolary exchange going on all that time, which has been published, these letters between them. And Schwager is trying to push him to accept the language. I mean, it's just essentially the language of sacrifice. And I notice how the Roman Catholic liturgy of the Mass has reaffirmed or doubled down on the language of sacrifice in the actual canon of the Mass. Since I just recently went to Mass a couple of times here in Lancaster, and it was very striking how there's been this recrudescence of sacrificial language in Catholic liturgy. Why would that be necessary? Because they're saying, well, okay, we got rid of it, or it was played down in the Vatican Council. We need to get back to that. And of course, Schwager was part of that. That if you ditch that, you ditch a main pillar of the Roman Catholic institution. Girard only slowly came around to that. And he doesn't describe that. He's not very good at, where are his diaries? Where is his personal journals? I don't think they exist, Everything is this external academic thinking. But at some point he accepts that the long arc of Roman Catholic history and institutional Christianity is a necessary element in holding back mimetic rivalry on a global scale. And he's dealing with that in Battling to the End. He talks about both those things. So you can see is what's preoccupying him. And he makes a shift from the original intuition of the breakdown of the sacrificial construct in human culture because of the biblical scriptures, because of the Gospels. He has this incredible lucid insight into that in the 60s and 70s. And he holds on to it. It's such a kind of like a destabilization of standard history of religion and anthropology thinking, structuralism, whatever. It's so trenchant. It goes right to the heart of things, and it's difficult. And there's lots of kickback. But he's very, very strong on it. But then slowly, the other side of it is, well, what does this mean for the actual world? I think begins to overcome it. I don't know whether he's thinking it through, but it's overshadowing him. So ultimately, he accepts the Roman Catholic position as given him by Schwager and retracts the semiotic value, the newness of the gospel semiotics of the kingdom of God, of the Son of Man, of the cross, breaking through the sacrificial with this infinite love. That is being offered to humankind and has been, and many people have embraced it, but it's viewing it in a kind of world historical frame. I think he does not think that through, or he hasn't got the theological tools. He doesn't want the theological tools for it. It's too much after the initial labor of making the inbreaking of mimetic anthropology, doing that initially. It's too much. This other thing is too much labor. And so he kind of goes back into his shell, or goes back into a shell that's offered him. And it's a safe place, and that's where he goes. That's where he ends up. So, I don't think that story's ever been properly told. I think it's only emerging. It'll only emerge under pressure. We are under pressure as human beings for all the things we were talking about, August the 6th, that kind of stuff. And so that story has to come out. But I think, yes, he does make a turn, and it's like an aircraft carrier, a very, very big ship at sea, slowly shifting around to another direction. I think Girard was wrong ultimately to give up on what he called manifest symbolic difference in his thinking. I laid that out in Love's Entanglement. He kind of gave up on that. I said, no, Christianity is about manifest symbolic difference. That's the only way we can be saved.
And is that where Raymund Schwager has gotten Girard off track?
Without a doubt. Raymund Schwager was, Brad, you want to say something?
I want to say, because you know, I'm of a different generation than you. I sort of have interpreted sacrifice as self-offering non-violently as gift. And Schwager's, must there be scapegoats? I think, having recently read it and others have said it does a better job of explaining much of Girard than Girard. So I'm not sure that for me that Schwager himself or his project or the project in which you're engaged with is quite so problematic in the way that I take on that semiotic shift of the language of sacrifice, which I simply read as nonviolent self-offering gift.
Right. Yeah. And I can say I'm glad you restrained me from a more uncontrolled response. But yeah, I mean, I read Must There Be Sacrifices way back at the beginning when I first encountered Girard. I mean, people told me when I came to the US that you have to read this. And I did. And I couldn't really, I didn't understand it in respect of Girard because I'd read Things Hidden first and then Violence and the Sacred. Then I came to Must There Be Scapegoats. And that follows on from Violence and the Sacred. I think Schwager had read that, and then he wrote Must There Be Scapegoats. But basically, he's saying that Christ is the universal scapegoat. And you don't get that language in Girard. And Girard says that he was uneasy with it. And I was uneasy with it because and I can see why what you say, it certainly works, is that in that kind of rather tragic kind of Catholic vein of Christ taking on our sins, it's not as though he's paying a price or anything to God, which is the Anselmian thing, but that he is suffering for us and he's offering himself for us, and that does happen. But there is such a proclivity of discharge in that, in terms of when you say he is the universal sacrifice, that we can, as the universal scapegoat, that we can legitimately discharge things on us rather than us being converted, being transformed to this new space that Christ brings with the cross and resurrection. Go and say to my brothers, I am ascending to my God and your God, my Father and your Father, that we are in this new transcendental space. So there's such a temptation, and I can see that all the time, and it is a part of enculturation that we slip back into some of the old formulation. I mean, and the Catholic tradition has been so full of that for many, many centuries. I can see why he would kind of defend that. But I was always very attracted by the radical breakthrough of the manifest symbolic difference, that because of everything that we were talking about beforehand, because of the bomb, because of the threat to humanity, that we can't, my thinking would be that we can't compromise with a kind of halfway place between the sacrificial order and the revelation of nonviolence with a universal scapegoat, but that actually the scapegoat is revealed as the place of divine nonviolence, so that you are brought into this new reality. Go ahead, Brad.
But so I want to push back, and perhaps this gets at the when a professor said, you grab a tiger by the tail when it comes to trying to engage in semiotics.
Yeah, you're right.
But
yeah.
for if with Pierce we are saying that the interpreter is an inherent part of semiotics, for me, for my semiotic world, especially in private conversations in which I've engaged with you, and I'm working through this person, I feel wounded, this person has wounded me, Imagine Jesus, their story, my story. Imagine Jesus's self-gifting love. Imagine myself with Jesus, accepting the suffering that I'm experiencing and offering back love. For me, that's an entirely concordant shift of, I am now going to embrace and go into the experience of suffering within the experience of being loved by Jesus and offering that love back to the person while experiencing the suffering that I'm experiencing. And so for me, that language of the image of the cross, in a new sense of sacrifice, has intense suffering with gift that is transformative. My thought world doesn't feel tempted at all within that to go into a more problematic modality. It compels me forward to process and love that person and offer gift. So I don't know if what I'm naming is, as I'm 52 and you're octogenarian. I don't know if the word.
Hang on. I am not
Oh, I
exactly
thought you were.
octogenarian yet.
Okay.
I'm 79.
Okay, so you're asymptotically octogenarian forever.
Oh, wow.
But I wonder if our mutual different thought worlds, because I was post-Vatican II, have allowed me to incorporate that language in a way that is impossible for you, and
Maybe.
then offers, and I'm offering this as a suggestive query. Is it possible that when we're talking about semiotic shifts, we want to very much tend to the particular narratives of each person, such that we don't stand outside of the system of symbols and say this is not possible, but we stand within the narratives of each person? I'm asking, is what I'm offering maybe perhaps utilizing your insights in such a way that maybe don't allow the strict demarcations that you want to be as commanding, but are more deeply in your theory of semiotic shifts? Is that possible? And come back at me hard. I'm German. I can take it.
Do not scapegoat yourself as a German. Well, no, I accept it because it is. I mean, you're entirely correct. It's the way we tell our stories, and the stories are never entirely finished. Where there's always another page, and then each new page will have an interpretative light on the previous pages. So yeah, I mean, if it's harmless, in other words, it doesn't kick back into the sacred or into the sacrificial. And I was persuaded beforehand that what I mean, my own reaction is very personal, and so I want to be aware that you can't impose, and you shouldn't. It's very, very dangerous to impose personal narrative on other people's narratives. That's for sure. There is this broad narrative that we converse in, the biblical narrative, and that's very, very important. But the idea of kind of perpetuating the language of sacrifice in the Mass, which is what Schwager is arguing for, because that's the way in which the Catholic Church understood its function and its work in the past. I reacted against that, and I think that because of the pressure of the times, and because of the immediacy of relationality, which we've been talking about, ultimately the Church does have to deal with, the Roman Catholic Church does have to deal with that. It has to deal with its sacrificial structure, which is not entirely honest and all the rest of it, because it displaces in other ways on other, like women or whatever. So that still has to be dealt with, and it has not been dealt with. And Schwager acted as a kind of guardrail in that respect, so that the Girard would be accepted. I mean, he says so explicitly, and you can read it in Chantre, the biography. He said, if you want this accepted at the highest levels, those were his words, you're going to have to use the language of sacrifice. He says that in a letter. And Shant reports it. So it's that what I mean, I'm reacting against it because those guardrails were erected around me, and I was existentially unable to sustain them. I just could not keep within them. I would have died in one way or the other. But I understand that for you, if that language, I mean, and language is always endlessly interpretable. You know, there's always in the Persian way of looking at it, there's always an interpretant coming after a statement that makes it clearer, makes it understandable, makes it intelligible, and then yet at the same time develops the understanding, develops the interpretation. So no, I mean that is the language, that the self-offering of Christ, which is what you were talking about, really. I mean, you didn't talk about Christ as a universal scapegoat. You talked about self-offering. This is not a sacrificial offering. This is self-giving for the sake of...
That's how I use, and, you know, sorry to interrupt. I just want to sort of...
No.
I want to sort of share my narrative. You know, I came into Catholicism from the post-Vatican II mom, and then I had an appropriation of my faith in which I was mentored by adults who helped me to do small group things and renewal things, and there you know, as a part of a revolution at the United States First Newman Center at St. Paul's in Madison, and we were a part of a renewal, which was a very healthy renewal, and we were helping students to really experience the love of God. And then I saw the kind of dark arm of traditionalism and liturgical fights come in, and I was like, what in the expletive it happened here? We had something quite beautiful. And so I've always felt quite comfortable from the small group tradition with then the blessing of very wise, very intelligent people and mentors and a formal education, and, you know, thinking of Illich and thinking of entering into people's silences, with entering into people's thought world, and from within that thought world, within the language that they are using, offer forms of life, small group, prayer, work with helping people, that to me reoriented all of those linguistic and conceptual hooks. And it didn't feel like much of a break, because I was not given an oppressive God until I was in 8th grade, and I had a poor catechist who was a fundy Catholic. So it just didn't happen for me in the way that it happened for you. And I'm holding that out because it is so difficult if for people who have some sense of the reality of the love of Christ and of the health, as Father Greg Boyle talks about it, who I can think of no better Catholic explicator of who we are here at Forging Plowshares, the health that the physician Jesus offers us, and the difficulty that people have in any kind of conceptual shift because they don't want to lose that. I mean, when I went to Notre Dame for the first summer and read Karl Rahner, I could not sleep for a week because I thought, am I losing my faith? But there's something real here. There's something real, but I do not want to lose my faith. So I just want to hold out in a pedagogical, mystagogical, ministerial mode that the creative semiotic shifts of the gospel can work within different linguistic systems, a la Illich saying you need to listen to the silences and you need to have the convivial face-to-face, the personalism. So you know, push back, but I offer this as I think I'm entirely in keeping with your insights here, and I want you to point out where I'm missing something of your deepest insights.
I don't think so, Brad. I mean, what we're doing now, actually, in live time, is telling our stories. I mean, we're in that kind of communication, and so this is a live process. the things are changing within me and within you, even as we speak. And Paul, and it's within the overarching message of the gospel, the story that Mary Magdalene brought to my brothers and sisters on that first morning. It's within that framework of this inbreaking, this intervention. I mean, that's always the thing that that's what I'm keen on, is not its particular emotional content in an individual, in terms of connections with other frames, but it's that inbreaking of God, of what we call God, because God is probably the most common noun in human language. There's not a denominator more used than that. So it's both extremely common to human beings, and then there's something radically new because it's nonviolent. So it's that inbreaking of this newness, this wonderful newness that I, for myself, am incompetent of. I sit before it, and I am radically incompetent to embrace this, because of my formal structure as a human being, because my particular structure as the grandchild of the Irish poor. But there's this endless grace held out to me. This by definition, the nonviolent never stops offering itself, in your words, to give itself to us. So that's what I'm keen on, is this radical, it's the message. It's not the formalization within an institution. And I take the Vatican Council as trying to liberate this message for the world at a time of crisis, is what Pope John the 23rd wanted. He'd seen the Second World War and the enormous potential for destruction. It's a desperate time for this inbreaking message. So that's where my kind of urgency would be. But I would certainly, in our mutual conversation, there is a kind of text. There's a weave of language that is not yours, not mine. It's something we dwell in. So I wouldn't draw a hard fast, and neither would I with Raymund Schwager. I mean, in my book, Love's Entanglement, I tried to show, just in quite a short passage, but I tried to show how Schwager himself identified nonviolence as the identification of the what do they call it, the different of what makes Christ different. It's that, he tried. It wasn't that he was any kind of compensation for sin, for original sin, but he was offering this radically new thing that had no rationale to it beyond the Father. So Schwager himself has that language, and can certainly unite with him on that. And I think, of course, all Christians do have that. At some point, you're going to have that language. But it is in terms of the urgency of our moment that I speak.
I'm agreeing with both of you, but I think we need to say this was the striking part of your book, Tony, that when you brought up Schwager.
Yeah.
However we want to read him, what you're saying is that Girard was so influenced by Schwager, in fact, you think, to abandon the heart of his project.
I wouldn't say he abandoned the heart, but he abandoned the praxis, the possibility of praxis. He gave up on this being a live, growing option. Obviously he's not going to give up on mimesis and of Christ being the overturning of violent mimesis, but in terms of how, like the fervor that I quote in the Esprit interview, that he was ready to take on the world, but he gave that up because the world was stronger than him. Ultimately it was stronger than him, and it's stronger than all of us without Christ. And but he did his part, and I think I'm very glad, Paul, that you recognize that, because I think that marker at this point in time, we're 2026, we're well into the 21st century, and we have these crises around the world that could, just one era of judgment or human fall could tip us over the edge. This is not a time for business as usual. I think to draw that marker and to say, well, there is a kind of post-Girardian thought. There is that is actually engages in the praxis that Girard let go of and retired into a kind of quietism, really, and a pessimistic quietism at that. Nothing like Maximus the Confessor, nothing like the idea of universal restoration, nothing like that, entirely the opposite end. So it's a very, you can see how Peter Thiel comes out of that, and you can see how, the Vance project comes out of that. We're entitled, you, Pope Leo XIV, do not understand just war, because we're at this moment of maximal, irreversible rivalry in the world. There's nothing we can do about it. So we just have to be the stronger. And that's an absolute rationale or ideology that you can see that Vance is totally comfortable with, and Peter Thiel is totally comfortable. They're set metaphysically. They know where they stand. But the gospel inbreaking has, and the very fact that we have Thiel and Vance using Girard shows that there was something. When I was interviewed by the French newspaper La Croix, the interviewer asked me, "Do you think there's something defective in Girard's thought?" And it was quite strong question. And I wasn't really ready for it, and I said, "No, I don't think so. I mean, his thought is very satisfying to me." I basically said it was the guys he hung out with. That was my answer. But I think there is something defective in the latter part of his thought. There is something defective. I think it becomes deficient.
And enter there. Can you explain that? In other words, what Peter Thiel, what J.D. Vance are doing, they imagine that they're advancing a Girardian idea of literally installing themselves as kind of the controlling element that they take as Girardian inspiration.
Well, I don't think they've embraced much of things hidden, that they've got that mechanics. I mean, that's the tremendous temptation of Girardian thinking, at large, is that it offers this mechanics of mimesis and scapegoating that you can see replicated everywhere. You suddenly become a genius of intuition when you can read out anything in terms of mimesis and scapegoating. And everybody, or many people get onto that. But Girard was rooted in the scripture in a way that I don't think he properly embraced himself. I mean, he was rooted in this semiotic tradition. And Peter Thiel recognizes that, I think, to some degree, when he says in that, really clarifying article in Politics and Apocalypse, the Straussian moment, which is, necessary reading for anybody who's trying to understand Thiel. He says, what are we going to do? Oh, sorry, it wasn't in that article, but it was important that I just said that it's necessary reading. It was an interview, I think he said it. What are we going to do? Just gather around in Bible study? He actually said that. Yes, that's what we're going to do. That is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to study this thing. There's this inbreaking of another meaning in the world. And you, because you reject that, you think it's puny and you also you think it's fundamentalist in some way. It's not rationalist. It's not enlightenment. And this is much more worldy kind of thinking to say that we need to take on. and we're going to be that. We're going to be this restraining influence, and isn't that cool? Because we now have surveillance all over the world, and I own it, and it's very, very profitable. So there's this conversions of high thinking theology, and I actually sit on top of it. I am the figure out of the apocalypse, the book of Revelation. It's incredibly hubristic. But the point is that the thing that he rejects is the very thing that can save us from this. What he's suggesting, I mean, what Girard has the wisdom to understand is that whenever you set this up, there will be a rival who'll want to take it from you. And the more you model it, the more the rival will see how to do it. And that's exactly what we got with Russia, China, progressively Iran, and the United States. They're our rivals, and Girard is right in that instance. But Thiel thinks that, I can master this. I can master the beast. I can have the Minotaur at the heart of my labyrinth, and I'm the one who owns it. That no one can do that. That it's built in. If there's a metaphysics, there's a metaphysics of the rival. You will never get rid of the rival. It will always come back to haunt you in one way or the other, and it will blow up in your face, and it's extremely dangerous. So that's why the gospel is the solution. And when the first disciples, as we all know, and it's a truism, when they started out, they were just this ragtag band of about 100 individuals, totally unprepared academically or professionally, but they started out with this message, and it expanded and expanded. Why? Because there was this breakthrough of another way of being human that people experienced at first hand, and that is the solution. And everything we've talked about, the gospel tells us this: go out and teach all nations. That's what the gospel ends with. So ultimately, Thiel and Vance are pitifully wrong, and it's sad because it's been tried many times before. Look at Napoleon. Look at them all. It's been tried so many times before. We just have new machinery, but the results will be the same. The gospel is the good news. Like Brad asked me in his preparation for this interview, what is the good news? Well, the good news is that we're not in this iron cage of history of metaphysics and violence, that we can break out of it, and we have the means. And it is about the Holy Spirit. It is about the rite of Christian initiation. It is about all the churches understanding, waking up to this reality in the world and embracing it and going out there and heedlessly teaching this. I don't care for the consequences. This is the message of the gospel, and we are sent to proclaim it. I mean, last night, my wife and I, Linda, since we've come to Lancaster, that's where we are. There is a church here, a Roman Catholic church, that does adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Now, this is something I hadn't seen for a long, long time. I don't know if you've experienced adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. It's just they get the bread of the Eucharist, they put it in this apparatus, which is a replica of the sun. It's kind of quite pagan in its traditional sense, but they put in the middle of it this piece of bread, so it just kind of shines out, and you sit there silently looking at it. And I love it because it's the semiotic. It's pure semiotics. There's just this sign. The night before he died, I mean, he left this theater, which I've explained in Theology Beyond Metaphysics. He left this theater of what he was doing, and it's just endured. And at some point, people just felt comfortable sitting in its presence, and not just eating it, but receiving the information that it contains. And that's the information of divine nonviolence communicated in human existence through the cross. and then the resurrection. So just to sit in front of it is enormously comforting for me. I don't know other people, but so after we did that, and it was August the 6th, it was the day of Hiroshima. And we left the church at the end, and outside there was this glorious rainbow, this beautiful rainbow, fully formed. And it was, like in the biblical story, that's the sign of peace. It's the semiotics of peace, that God will bring creation to peace one day. There's these colors in the sky that are perfectly circular, spherical, and it's a promise that human beings have received, that this project will come to peace. And so those semiotics, both in the bread and the rainbow, they're playing out all the time, in our lives, and you only have to look for them.
Maybe that's a good segue, that there's the sign of the atomic bomb, that mushroom, cloud.
Yeah.
That is the ultimate Holocaust.
Yeah.
That is the end of metaphysics.
Yes.
That really does signal where this thing would take us. And then there's the sign of the cross, the sign of the bread, the countersign.
Amen. Absolutely. I mean, that's the gospel.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.